Okay, so our previous slide left off with this idea of ecological imperialism, and just to briefly recap what it is to make sure everyone understands. Okay, this is a theory advanced by Crosby that argued that the conquest of the New World was less about, the inherent superiority of Europe, right, with their superior military technology, cannon, firearms and so forth, or superior cultures, so to say, like Christianity, civilization, and so forth, and whatever reasons they put up, right? And this relates to, let's recall, exceptionalism, European exceptionalism, right? As the reason why it was inevitably the case that conquest happened, that the New World succumbed to the superior, quote unquote, old world. Crosby argues that rather than, ideas about exceptionalism, it was rather due to biological reasons, right? That is to say, the advent of deadly microorganisms, again, the diseases that wreaked havoc upon the population. And there before you on the slide is a depiction of indigenous artists who, was attempting to represent, this the physical symptoms of this, how it led to this enormous loss of life, right? And you can see the smallpox covering their skin. Here you see someone caring for the sick person, but you see, this thing here that relates to this understanding, a causal understanding that germs are being spread, right? Even though we don't have germ theory around yet, that's going to be well into the future. But they understood some causal relation between, you know, um, um, you know, the exchange of something, right, like saliva or sneezing or what have you, right, causing disease. What we call today communicable disease. Okay, so again, Crosby argues that it's all about germs that led to conquest, not Western superiority or European superiority. And again, that questions this idea of exceptionalism as well as underlining the fact that it's a contingent truth that this happened. Okay. So imperialism was less about people and more about ecology. Notice ecology does not commit imperialism typically, right? Imperialism is a man-made activity, but he puts the two terms together, ecology and imperialism, right? Okay, so, if you look at this previous slide, we were talking about the Columbian Exchange here, and we just referred to germs being exchanged, right? Well, one thing that got exchanged uh, are ideas, you know. Certainly the most prevalent idea, perhaps the most important idea that got brought over with the Columbian Exchange from the Old World to the New World was Christianity. And, especially with Spain, they were very much motivated to spread Christianity, to evangelize, particularly Catholicism, because the Spanish Empire was Catholic and not Protestant. Okay, so God is a very important idea, right, religion, but also this idea of civilization. Okay, and here I'm discussing this thing called civilization as a European discourse. Discourse is just a fancy way academically to talk about a worldview. So just think of it as a worldview. And obviously, this relates to a European worldview. Okay, the European worldview of civilization that got transferred from the old world to the new world during the 16th century, the 1500s. So, what do we mean by civilization? Well, I've been using this term actually from the very beginning, but I'm using it in a very general sense. For example, I talk about the various civilizations of the New World before contact, right? Or I talk about Chinese civilization during the Ming Dynasty, European civilization, African civilization, so on and so forth. But that's not what we're talking about in this specific context. rather civilization during the early modern period, and then spilling over into even the 20th century, is this idea that Europe is inherently superior to other civilizations of the world because it practices or observes or adopts certain traits, characteristics, and habits, right, that elevate them above those who don't conform to those particular traits, characteristics, and habits. Okay, this is the idea of civilization. Now, perhaps the easiest way to think about civilization is to think about its opposite, right? There are civilized people, but then there's uncivilized people, according to this language or discourse or worldview. Okay, this idea of being uncivilized, well, that's the way of thinking about civilization when you negate it, right? Meaning that what's the opposite of civilization? Uncivilized. Okay, so this is what's being brought forth, across the Columbian Exchange. One idea, right, aside from others. So the next line here asks for what specific conditions constituted this notion of civilization that was brought across, right? So in other words, what defined you as a society if you were a civilized society? And, you could probably think of some of these off the top of your head, right? But let's list a few here. We already mentioned Christianity. Christianity was a big part of this definition of civilization back then. If you were not Christian, if you were some kind of heathen or pagan, you were considered not civilized. You're considered savages, right, or uncivilized. Let's recall that many, not all, but many of the tribes that they would encounter, the indigenous tribes, practice a form or a religious practice whereby they worshipped, nature, right? The animals, the surrounding, the wind, the sun, right? This is called animism. So you could imagine the European settlers coming over, observing the indigenous people practicing animism, and arriving at the conclusion that they are not civilized, right? So what are some other conditions of civilization? Even the mere fact of settlement. Now, putting aside the idea that there were cities, right? I talked about Cahokia in the St. Louis region. Remember, during the 1300s, that was populated by, up to, 40,000 people, if not more. Putting that aside, in the other cities like Tenochtitlan of the Aztec Empire, many of the early European explorers would encounter Indian people who were not settled, who were not bound to the earth, who were not agriculturalists or farmers, who seemed to be roaming around just like the animals were, right? So because of this, because of their hunter-gatherer sort of lifestyle, their nomadic lifestyle, they tended to lump them all together just like the animals, like they were part of the landscape, right? So therefore, settlement from the European perspective of civilization is part of the condition of civilization, being settled. Why? Because once you settle, once you have this settlement, you have towns forming, right? And then eventually you have even cities where you could, develop government, civilized, sort of associations between people within the city, right? Another word for that is civil society, using the word civil, right? You could have even refined culture, right? Like, say, Shakespeare literature, right, during the 1600s. The classical composers in Europe, right? Why? Because they develop in the urban areas, not the rural farming areas, right? Okay, so it's thought to be civilized if you have settlement and what follows from settlement, like we just discussed. Other things too, like social norms or cultural norms, things like gender roles, right? I talked about the farmers, the indigenous people who were farmers, and how they thought women, right, according to their gender roles, were the ones who should work the field, right? Well, alongside men in many cases, right? Women were not exempt from working in the fields. But if you're a European, you thought that was uncivilized, according to your specific gender role in Europe. Women do not belong in the field. They belong in the actual home where they take care of household duties, domestic duties, plus caring for the children, cooking, cleaning, what have you. Okay. All right. So another thing or related to culture would be, the way you dress, or perhaps the lack of dress, right? Again, we talked about this in the past, how Europeans first observed the men and women and noticed that they were much less clothed than Europeans. And according to European civilization, the worldview of civilization, you have to be clothed completely, right? You don't show skin. So if you're showing skin, if women are disrobed, they're, well, they're not civilized, right? So again, the discourse or worldview of civilization is a hierarchy, right? If you're civilized, you are above those who are uncivilized. Now, notice here that, if you don't conform to the conditions of civilization, then you're uncivilized, or another way to put it is you are savage, right? Now, in any sort of social context, in, the interaction with people, it's inevitably the case that you have power relations that become imbued within, human relations. Okay, I don't care if it's the priest and the congregation, where the priest is in power, or the family, where in a patriarchal society it's the father in power and dominating the wife and the children. Of course, you have the monarch versus the lord, right? The aristocracy, or the emperor versus the regular person, right? So there's always relations of power, even though we might not recognize it, as being obvious, right? There's always power involved. And certainly this becomes embedded in this collision of people and their worldviews. Once you believe in civilization, if you're a European explorer and you decide to settle in the New World, you believe in civilization, you take it as sort of universal worldview that applies to all people, right? Well, for those who are the native inhabitants, since they are uncivilized and therefore savage, they are considered inferior, right? Because it's a hierarchy. Again, civilization automatically suggests, a hierarchy of those on top and those in the bottom. So, because they're relegated as savages, or let me just put it this way. Once you have relations of power between the two groups, Old World and New World, if the Europeans size them up as being savage, well, they justify, as the next step in their logic, right? They justify the subjugation of those who are uncivilized or those who are savage. In other words, there's nothing wrong if you subjugate them, you dominate them, because they are inferior in the first place. And this is going to relate to not only our discussion of how Native Americans are going to be enslaved by the Spanish, but also it's part of U.S. history, American history, right? We believed in this dichotomy or duality between civilization and savagery for a long time. In fact, by the turn of the 20th century, I'm jumping way ahead in our history, but by the 1900s, we had subjugated Indians. We forced them to settle. There's this idea of settlement, right? Part of civilization. We forced them to settle on reservations in order to adopt civilization and be civilized, right? No longer savages. And there you go. It was thought that this is a way to extinguish savagery, was to force Indians to adopt, quote, the habits of civilized life, unquote. There was a slogan back then during this time, quote, kill the Indian, save the man, unquote. Okay, so that's what it's referring to, all right? Okay, so we're going to return constantly to this dichotomy or this division between civilization and savagery. So we're going to move on to the next video. Well, actually, yeah, we'll do that. Okay.